Benvinguts al Centre Octubre de Cultura Contemporània, que ha acollit aquesta sessió dels col·loquis de la Societat Catalana d'Història, de la Ciència i de la Tècnica. Sempre és un plaer. La Societat Catalana d'Història, de la Ciència i de la Tècnica vol descentralitzar d'alguna manera les seves activitats i el Centre Octubre com a espai col·laborador amb la delegació a València de l'Institut d'Estudis Catalans sempre està disposat a acollir-nos, la qual cosa hem d'agrair sincerament. It's my pleasure to introduce Henrik Hjermitslev. Henrik is a Danish historian of science and education. He earned his PhD in history of science at Aarhus University. And the title of his thesis was Debating Darwinism in Denmark, 1859-1920. He has worked as a lecturer and researcher at the Department of Education, University College South Denmark, and currently he is the president of the Danish Society for the History of Education. His research interests include science and religion, science in popular culture, public enlightenment, science education, and obviously the history of Darwinism and Creationism. He has published in such prestigious journals as Annals of Science, Public Understanding of Science, Journal of the American Academy of Religion, Journal of the History of Ideas, Centaurus, or Science and Education. I met Henrik 12 years ago at a workshop on creationism in Europe that took place in the Belgian city of Ghent. Recruited somewhat repetitiously, we can say, by the world's foremost authority on the history of creationism, Ronald Numbers, professor at Wisconsin, who had come to Valencia that year to see the Fallas, our festival, our major festival. I was intimidated by such a volume of experts, given my limited expertise. Fortunately, I was very warmly received by the promoters of the meeting, one of whom was precisely Henrik. The result was this book, Creationism in Europe, published by Johns Hopkins University Press, which received very good reviews. My chapter, in any case, devoted to the Iberian case, Spain and Portugal, has had little success in terms of citation. Note that the apprehensions about my lack of knowledge and expertise were probably justified. With Henrik, I issue another link. This one linked not so much to the history of creationism as to the history of evolution and evolutionism. Two sides, in fact, two sides of the same coin, evidently. Henrik was deeply involved in this great major work, printed in 4 very, very expensive volumes, promoted by my dear teacher, Thomas Glick, from Boston University, who left so deep mark in Valencia as a result of his research on the reception of Darwinism in Spain, and previously on the medieval irrigation systems in Lorca during the Muslim and Christian period. Tom, who even acquired a second home in a village in the Comtat, in our Valencian country, has been the great champion of the history of evolutionary ideas in comparative perspective. Certainly, this is an approach in comparative perspective to the different European traditions about evolutionism, basically from the cultural viewpoint in a very broad sense. Ensuring a mentor of this stature, no doubt, is another reason for a cosmic connection with Henrik. Well, in a way, then I was destined to introduce today our speaker, who has very kindly agreed to participate in this cycle of colloquia organized by the Società Catalana di Storia della Scienza e della Tecnica. Thank you, Hans Henry, for your generosity, and thank you for attending this conference with us. You now is about Darwinism, Denmark, reflection on the history of evolution relation from the cultural struggles in the 1870s to modern creationism.
Thank you very much for inviting me to deliver a lecture here at the Catalan Society for the History of Science and Technology. It's a great honor to be here. Spain, and especially Catalonia, has been an important part of my professional life. As a history of science student, all the way back in 2006, I presented my very first international paper at the Balearic island of Menorca. It was under the auspices of the network Science and Technology in the European periphery, and dealt with the science in Danish newspapers around 1900. It was published in the Journal of the European Society for the History of Science, Centaurus, in 2009. This volume also included wonderful studies of newspapers in Barcelona and in Greece. In fact, some of the points from this work will be included in this lecture. First and foremost, the idea of Darwinism as a part of a scientific marketplace in which controversial topics such as Charles Darwin, evolution, and religion were exploited by publishers, editors, translators, and authors to earn money. Later, in 2010, I read a paper at the 4th International Conference of the European Society for the History of Science in Barcelona. As you maybe would know, the conference was organized by the Catalan Society for the History of Science and Technology at the Institute for Catalan Studies. In Barcelona, my focus was on the role of local contexts in the appropriations of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. In line with the historiographical focus on microhistories, local contexts, and geographies of science, I demonstrated in Barcelona how Darwinism was communicated and debated as part of a larger cultural struggle between advocates of competing urban and rural worldviews. The role of local context will also play a central part in my lecture today. My focus will thus be on the specific religious and cultural environments that shape the Danish reception of Darwinism. After 2010, my work on Darwinism in Denmark, part of which was published in Thomas Glick's 4 volumes on the reception of Charles Darwin in Europe, as Jesus mentioned, my work developed into a broader perspective. Thus, in 2014, I edited a volume on creationism in Europe, together with Peter Kjærgaard and Stefan Blanke. In this book, we tried to map the religious opposition towards evolution in Europe from the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859 to modern-day creationism. As an editor, I had the pleasure of working with Jesus, who wrote a groundbreaking chapter on Iberian creationism. Jesus is now president of the society. Much later, in 2022, I met the secretary of the society, Marvi Correa-Domenech. She visited me at University College South Denmark, where we had very interesting discussions about our common interest in both the history of science and the history of education. The prime focus in our discussion was on the controversial Danish educator and evolutionist Wilhelm Rasmussen. In a recent article, Marvi has brilliantly shown how Rasmussen's book, Nature Study in the School, was translated into Spanish and used to renew science education in Spain in the 1930s. My work on creationism, as well as my work on Wilhelm Rasmussen, will also be part of this lecture. Moreover, in 2015, I contributed to Bernard Leitman's volume on global Spencerism, in which I analyzed the appropriations of the British evolutionist Herbert Spencer in Scandinavia. One of the main results of the study was that the reception of Spencer's philosophical, educational, biological, and sociological work differed significantly among the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, due to different intellectual environments. Thus, Spencer made a much greater impact in Denmark than in Sweden or Norway because of the dominance of positivist academics at the University of Copenhagen from the 1870s. Among these academics were the literary critic Georg Brandes, who will play a prominent role in this lecture. Now, let me outline the plan for the lecture. In the first section, I will analyze the role of Darwinism in the debates over science and religion in Denmark from the 1870s to 1914. I will try to include a comparative perspective by relating the Danish case to the Spanish and the British cases. Then, in the second section, I'll discuss modern creationism in Denmark and compare it to the situation in other countries, including Spain. Finally, I'll try to outline avenues for further transnational research in Darwinism and creationism. However, we will begin in Denmark in the 1870s, when Darwin became a household name among the Danes. His main works were translated into Danish at this time, and thus parallels the Spanish case, while translation into Catalan had to wait a while. Like in the British, Spanish, and Catalan cases, Darwin's theory of evolution was met with opposition among Christian thinkers. However, in the Danish and British cases, Protestants quite early developed strategies to come to terms with Darwinism, while the antagonism between Catholics and Darwinists seems to have been more heated and clear-cut in Spain and Catalonia. This is exemplified by the so-called university crisis in 1875, when Darwinian scientists were excluded from the University of Madrid and went on to establish a free university. And it was also exemplified by the open conflict between a Darwinian professor and the Bishop of Barcelona in 1895, and by the extravagant Valencian celebration of the centenary of Darwin's birth in 1909, which was described as an homage to the devil by the conservative Catholic press. Thus, the debates in Denmark were more peaceful than here in Valencia, but as we shall see, Darwin was still a controversial figure in Denmark. No doubt, the hotbed of evolutionary theory in Denmark was the capital of Copenhagen, which was the only urban center in the country. In the early 1960s, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was debated among naturalists at the University of Copenhagen, and it was also debated in the National History Society, and it was disseminated through articles in the popular press. This echoes the general global picture, with cities and universities serving as the vehicles for the transmission of Darwinism. However, I will argue that in the Danish case, we have to include other geographical places than cities to grasp the complexity and broader cultural context of the Darwinian debates. I suggest that it would be useful, at least in the Danish case, to distinguish between what I have termed urban and rural Darwinism. Studies by Ronald Numbers, Jeffrey Cantor, and many others have shown how it would be problematic to talk about the reception of Darwinism in a specific country. Rather, within each country, there were often several ethnic groups and languages and several interpretations, appropriations, and uses of Darwinism. This has motivated historians to look at the reactions to evolution at a sub-national level. During the last decades, studies have thus analyzed the role of Darwinism among ethnic minorities and at specific localities such as universities, museums, cities, and regions. In a now classic study of Calvinist attitudes towards Darwinism at Presbyterian universities in Belfast, Edinburgh, and Princeton, the geographer and historian of science, David Livingstone, has demonstrated how local contexts, more than theological doctrines, determine the various responses to organic evolution. Livingstone points out that the attention paid to local circumstances is part of a more general spatial turn within history and sociology, including science studies. Livingstone thus advocates the primacy of the local, the specific, and the situated in the construction and reception of scientific knowledge. In many respects, Livingstone geographies of science resemble contextual approaches, which has dominated the historiography of science at least since the 1980s, and parallels a growing focus on microhistory and book history among historians of science. In line with this historiographical focus on locality, in this lecture, the spatial categories urban and rural will function as the central analytical categories. I will now outline the broader political and cultural landscape of Denmark relevant to the discussion of Darwinism in Denmark. In 1849, Denmark became a constitutional monarchy, that means a kind of a democracy, but conflicts concerning the democratic constitution caused a civil war with the German-speaking inhabitants in the southern part of the country, named Slesvig and Holstein, which represented around 1/3 of the territory and population. While the ethnic Danes were victorious in this war, the Second Schleswigian War in 1864 resulted in a defeat to the German enclaves supported by Austria and Prussia. After 1864, Denmark was reduced to a very small monocultural nation state with colonies in the West Indies and in the North Atlantic Sea. In 1890, the population of the remaining part of Denmark reached 2.2 million, of whom the majority were farmers. Agriculture was the dominant industry, although Denmark witnessed a rapid urbanization from the 1890s and onwards. In the aftermath of the Great War in 1920, the ethnically Danish northern part of Slesvig was reunited with Denmark. Now, despite a majority of seats in the two chambers of parliament, the Liberal Party remained in opposition until 1901, when the Conservative Party and the King finally accepted cabinet responsibility, meaning that the majority of parliament choose who to be in government. And the first Liberal movement was appointed in 1901. Within the Liberal Party, there were strong tensions between, on the one hand, a group of nationals from the provinces, the rural areas, who were rooted in Christian culture and followers of the influential Protestant clergyman and philosopher N.F.S. Grundtvig, as you can see on the screen there. And on the other hand, on the other side of the Liberal Party, a group of anti-clerical, anti-Christian radicals inspired by the literary critic Georg Brandes, who had a stronghold among the educated classes in the capital of Copenhagen and assembled at the radical club, the Society of Students. This was the other group within the Liberal Party. The Socialist Party remained outside circles of political power until it took over government in 1924. During the so-called cultural struggle from the 1870s, when freethinkers associated with Brandes conflicted with conservatives and liberal convenience over political, educational, cultural, and clerical issues, a gap between rural culture and urban culture became visible. While a young generation of academics with positivist and radical sympathies were gaining ground at the University of Copenhagen, farmers and clergymen with Grundtvigian sympathies established an alternative rural culture in the provinces. The rural movement was politically liberal, and it founded more than 100 folk high schools in the provinces from 1844 to 1920. The schools combined liberal education with practical teaching of agriculture. The most prominent of these schools was placed in Askov near the German border to Slesvig. Far away from rural Askov in urban Copenhagen, the scientific world was dominated by three institutions of higher learning: the University of Copenhagen, the Polytechnical College, and the Royal Veterinary and Agricultural College. The university was a traditional four-faculty institution with theology, medicine, law, and philosophy, but as early as 1948, it became possible for students to earn a master's degree in natural science, natural history. That is quite early compared to many other countries. Reflecting the growing importance of natural science, in 1950, a new faculty of science was created. However, until 1880, the faculty of theology produced the largest number of candidates. By then, medicine gained the position, while the professional natural history community remained small and restricted to institutions, museums, and laboratories in Copenhagen. In contrast to the heated confrontations at Spanish universities, evolutionary theory was generally and gradually rather peacefully accepted among professional naturalists in Denmark. And from the 1880s, it became an integral part of the teachings at the institutions of higher learning in Copenhagen. However, by that time, Darwinism had long been embraced as the basis of a new secular worldview among the close-knit group of urban radicals in Copenhagen, who popularized the theory of evolution in public lectures, pamphlets, periodicals, and book series. Among this urban group, no one did more to popularize Darwinism than the botanist and poet Jens Peter Jacobsen. He translated The Origin of Species and Descent of Man and wrote several articles on Darwinism in the first half of the 1870s. His translation of The Origin of Species was based on the 5th edition from 1869, and it was sent out as 9 booklets in 1,500 copies from November 71 to November 1872. The Descent of Man was published in 13 parts from October 74 to November 75. This time circulation was scaled down to 1,250 copies, so apparently there were not that many Danes interested in Darwin's theory. While translating Darwin, Jacobsen was engaged in both scientific and literary work. He wrote articles on Darwinism for the radical journal New Danish Monthly, which sparked up polemics with the anti-Darwinian bishop D.G. Monrad, and worked on a dissertation on freshwater algae, which resulted in the prestigious University of Copenhagen gold medal in 1873. Meanwhile, he was writing the novel Marie Grubbe, a lady of the 17th century. From 1872, Jacobsen had been on friendly terms with the young journalist and freethinker Edvard Brandes, who was overwhelmed by what he regarded as Jacobsen's exceptional poetical talent. The influential Edvard Brandes made sure that Jacobsen's literary works were well received in the press, and he played an important role in convincing Jacobsen that he should devote his life to poetry and prose instead of botanical work. Jacobsen became part of the circle of freethinkers which developed around Edvard's brother, the literary critic Georg Brandes, who embraced Jacobsen's work on Darwinism and applied it in his liberal struggle against the church and the conservative order. The polemical and anti-clerical potential of Darwin's work was thus exploited by Brandes and supported by Jacobsen in his translations and popular articles on Darwinism. The translation work was by no means an easy task for Jacobsen. In 1971, the editor of the leading publishing house Gyldendal, Henrik Hjermitslev, accepted Jacobsen's offer of translating The Origin of Species, but the translation was only completed 15 months later. Even worse with Descent of Man, on which Jacobsen spent 3 years. There were, however, good reasons for this. From 1873, Jacobsen was severely debilitated by tuberculosis, which forced him to leave Copenhagen and live with his family in his native town of Thisted in western Jutland. And moreover, he spent much time and energy on his work on Marie Grubbe while translating Descent of Man. Hegel had to press Jacobsen for installments, which were nonetheless delayed several times. In June 1873, Jacobsen revealed to Edvard Brandes that he was almost getting sick of translating Darwin. So it's tough work for him. And after submitting the last chapter of Descent of Man in the autumn of 1875, Jacobsen abandoned science writing and translating for good. In his translation, Jacobsen drew on the writings of the German scientist Ernst Haeckel and his monistic interpretation of Darwinism. Notable, the original 9 installments containing the translation of The Origin of Species was entitled The Basic Laws of Nature, an attempt to assert the unity of the organic world, while it was only the complete edition that had a literal translation. The title of the installments emphasized the wider monistic aspects of the theory of evolution and thereby connected it to Haeckel's natural history of creation, which was consulted by Jacobsen during his translation work and translated into Danish in 1877. After 1875, Jacobsen lived as a full-time novelist, disturbed only by periods of bad health due to tuberculosis, which finally ended his life in 1886. As part of his secular campaign, Hjermitslev claimed in the German highbrow journal Deutsche Rundschau in May 1883 that Jacobsen's articles in 1871 were the first popular introduction to Darwin in Denmark and even in Scandinavia. Since then, historians of science have refuted this claim and showed that Darwin and his theory were indeed debated in the popular press already in the 1860s. However, from the 1870s, among the people, Darwinism was indeed strongly associated with Copenhagen radicalism and the atheist agenda of Jacobsen and Brandes. The theologian and 1917 Nobel Prize winner for literature, Carl Gellerup, was another early urban Darwinist connected to the radical society of students in Copenhagen. He came from a family of clergymen, but when he graduated with a theological degree, he had lost faith, presumably due to his experiences with biblical criticism. His novels often focused on the relationship between Christians and heretics, and he clearly sided with the latter ones, the heretics. He was a devoted disciple of the radical literary critic Georg Brandes, and his strong support of Darwinism and naturalism was evident in his dissertation, Heredity and Morality, for which he was awarded the prestigious University Gold Medal. Shortly after Charles Darwin's death in 1882, Gellerup published a high-flown hagiographical ode to the memory of the British naturalist entitled Spirits and Times, a Requiem of Charles Darwin, in which he depicted God as a lost and lonely man who passively witnessed that his creation, nature and man, did not care about him anymore. According to Gellerup, Darwin had initiated a new secular worldview that would do away with old Christian dogmas. This secularist narrative was an echo of Brandes' proclamation in 1871 that, and I quote, "We who live in the age of Charles Darwin no longer believe in the possibility of an original paradisal state and a fall. There is no doubt that Darwin's theory will strike down orthodox morality the same way Copernicus's theory struck down orthodox dogmatics. Like Copernicus's system deprived the church heaven of its external place, someday Darwin's theory will deprive the church paradise of its." So a very anti-clerical idea that Georg Brandes put forth here. So among the Danes, Darwinism was associated with an anti-Christian attitude. During a spiritual revival among urban intellectuals in the late 1880s and 1890s, when the Brandes circle collapsed and Brandes shifted his attention from Darwinism, naturalism, and positivism to the aristocratic teaching of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, the first generation of urban Darwinists, such as Jacobsen and Gellerup, were replaced by a new generation of Copenhagen Darwinists who were natural history graduates from the university and eager to promote the evolutionary gospel. The natural history teacher and science writer Jens Orten Bøving Petersen was among the most influential and prolific popularizers of natural science in Denmark in the decades around 1900. Two of his popular works on natural history were published under the imprints of the successful book series Frem, that means forward, and published in up to 100,000 copies. And that's a lot in Denmark. Since his student days in the 1880s, Bøving Petersen had been an enthusiastic advocate of Darwinism. He was a devoted disciple of the embryologist Rudolf Berg, who introduced Ernst Haeckel's comparative methods and phylogenetic work at the University of Copenhagen. Bøving Petersen wrote several articles and books that informed about evolution. In 1897, his polemical and anti-clerical work, Creation or Evolution, was published by the Society of Students. Bøving Petersen sharply contrasted the biological theory of evolution with the biblical history of creation, the theory of separate creations and notions of a divine plan in nature. He piled up empirical evidence taken from morphological investigation, the geographical distribution of plants, the fossil record, studies of embryos and taxonomy, which he considered in favor of evolution and made a creationist view seem untenable and even preposterous. The ridicule of Christian views on creation and Bøving Petersen's conception of a necessary conflict between evolution and Christianity made the Jesuit amateur naturalist Amund Beitung. Yeah, we actually had a Jesuit amateur naturalist in Denmark. He was a secondary school teacher at a Catholic gymnasium in Copenhagen. He wrote a rejoinder to Bøving Petersen called The Bankruptcy of the Ape Theory and Our Popular Darwinism in 1899, in which he attacked popular Darwinism as advocated by radical and socialist writers and the Society of Students. Like his mentor, the evangelical professor of plant ecology, Øben Warming, Beitung defended a restricted form of theistic evolutionism, but excluded humans from the evolutionary process. Thus, a Catholic amateur naturalist and an evangelical professor of botany joined forces in combating the theory of common descent, which was seen as the most controversial aspect of the theory of evolution. Thus, this in turn reflects the situation in Spain, actually, where human evolution, the so-called ape theory, was also the most debated aspect of evolutionary theory. It was the controversial thing that man was related to apes. On the centenary of Darwin's birth in the 12th of February 1909, Beitung and Warming, the anti-Darwinists, were very critical to the radicals and the Darwinists. And one of the Darwinists, Bøving Petersen, he wrote a commemorative article for the radical liberal newspaper Politiken. And here Darwin was celebrated as a secular saint who had liberated mankind from Christianity and old-fashioned views. So we see these two fronts, the Darwinists and the anti-Darwinists against each other. And now we come to Wilhelm Rasmussen. He was like Bøving Petersen, educated within natural history. Rasmussen was a natural history teacher, and he later became an internationally acclaimed educational and psychological writer. And he was in line with Bøving Petersen in his appraisal of Darwin. During his university studies in the 1890s, Rasmussen became an outspoken atheist, socialist, and a supporter of Darwinism. He popularized his controversial views in lectures and books, which resulted in removals, complaints, and many controversies. In the first decades of the 20th century, Rasmussen wrote the popular works on evolution, the evolution of the world, and evolution of man, and several biology textbooks from an evolutionary and materialist point of view. He also engaged in debates in educational journals about the teaching of natural history, which was introduced as a compulsory subject at secondary and high school levels in school reforms around 1900. Rasmussen offended many Christians by ridiculing the biblical history of creation. Bøving Petersen and Rasmussen, who remained faithful to the secular and materialist agenda of the first generation of urban Darwinists, were the most controversial pro-Darwinian writers in the early 20th century, and they were often attacked by both evangelicals and liberals. liberal Christians. Especially Wilhelm Rasmussen was seen as a threat to established religion and Christian faith, since his works were widely advertised and read around 1900, and thus had a prominent place in what Eileen Fyfe and Bernard Leitman has coined the scientific marketplace. Adverts with a dinosaur for his work were on evolution of the world had a prominent place in the newspapers. As a market strategy, the book was published in installments for subscription, like the Darwin translation 25 years earlier, but it sold much better. It is remarkable that the pro-evolutionary books by Rasmussen and others were advertised and reviewed in the socialist and radical press, while works by the anti-Darwinist Zeitung and others were advertised and reviewed in the conservative press. Moreover, the advertising campaigns were part of a publishing war between the leading publishing houses, Gyldendal and Nordisk Forlag. Thus, financial and ideological interests went hand in hand in the scientific marketplace. And that's one of my big interests, to see how actually ideology and scientific ideas and stuff is also part of like a financial struggle to get the customers to earn money. So money is always there, even within science and ideological and science and religion debates. However, the Darwinian campaigns of Rasmussen and all his popular books did not convince all Danes, of which no less than 95% were members of the National Evangelical Lutheran Church. So Denmark was a Protestant Christian country at this time. Many were still critical of Darwinism and saw it as a problem for Christian faith. So they remained hostile to evolutionary theory in the decades around 1900. And this is no surprise, since Darwin theory, as I have told you, had been associated with radicalism and atheism since the 1870s. For example, the renowned natural science teacher in Askov, one of the Grundtvigian folk high schools, the teacher was called Paul Lacour, wrote critical responses to Darwinism in Grundtvigian periodicals in this period. And another Grundtvigian, the Reverend Hjermitslev, published a book in 1901 attacking human evolution as promoted by Wilhelm Rasmussen and Bøving Peters. No surprise, Hjermitslev book, an attack on Darwinism, was advertised and positively reviewed in the conservative press. However, from the 1880s, a group of liberal followers of Grundtvig, the so-called neo-Grundtvigians, included controversial issues such as biblical criticism, modern literature, and evolutionary theory in their writings and teachings at the folk high schools, and thus attempted to reconcile the results of modern science with their Christian worldviews. Among these rural Darwinists, we find one of the very few female high school teachers, Eline Bechtel, who taught zoology at the Espai Folk High School from 1886 to 95, and later became a headmaster of her own folk high school and a prolific freelance lecturer and science writer. Bechtel was instrumental in introducing natural history in particular evolutionary theory at the Protestant Grundtvigian folk high schools. She lectured on Darwinism from the 1890s and published widely on Charles Darwin and the history of evolution in Grundtvigian periodicals, including the leading mouthpiece for the liberal fraction of the movement, the High School magazine. By arguing that Darwinism and Christianity were not mutually exclusive, she played an important role in legitimizing the teaching of evolution at the folk high schools. Importantly, in 1914, she contributed to a special issue on the theory of evolution published by the High School magazine. This special issue is one behind me, which included informative and positive articles on Darwin's theory, was a strong signal to the rural readers that evolution could be reconciled with Christian faith. In Ågård near Askov, another Christian defender of Darwinism, Valdemar Brügger, served as a pastor and folk high school headmaster. As a prolific writer in the liberal Grundtvigian periodicals, the High School magazine, and Contemporary Current, Valdemar Brügger was one of the most prominent advocates of the neo-Grundtvigians, who introduced modern science and literature and biblical criticism in Grundtvigian circles. Initially educated as an engineer, Brøgger understood the scientific value of evolutionary theory and frequently touched upon the topic. In line with the Danish philosophers Søren Kierkegaard and Rasmus Nielsen, Brøgger made a radical distinction between faith and knowledge, which left room for both evolution and Christianity. Brøgger combined this separation model of science and religion with a liberal interpretation of NFS Grundtvig's theology. In 1884, he phrased it as follows, and I quote, "And in any case, it is a great relief to see that faith is autonomous, independent of science, that theological attempts to support faith by scientific arguments is nonsense, and that faith is perfectly self-contained, explains itself, and is based on its own principles. And it is in accordance with Grundtvig's ideas. When he, as Grundtvig, pointed to the sacraments, he pointed to what can be believed. Then Rasmus Nielsen makes one abandon all satanic attempts to believe the entire Bible word for word, but is helped by Grundtvig to realize what you can and should believe. Brøgger emphasized Grundtvig's anti-scriptural church view, which included the notion that the living word of Christ was primary to the letters of the Bible, and that the cornerstone of Christianity was not scripture, as in traditional Lutheranism, but the sacraments and the apostolic creed. By advocating this aspect of Grundtvig's teaching and downplaying Grundtvig's literal interpretation of Genesis and orthodox geocentrism apparent in his philosophy of history, Brøgger made it possible for himself and other new Grundtvigians to embrace ideas which seems at odds with the Bible, such as biblical criticism and Darwinism. Brøgger's most elaborate assessment of Darwinism was published in his major work, A View of Life from 1916. Like Brandes, he discussed Copernicus and Darwin's challenge to a Christian worldview, but he drew very different conclusions. According to Brøgger, heliocentrism and evolution did not destroy the fundament of Christianity. Rather, these challenges had clarified matters and made it evident that Christianity could and should not base its truth on the Bible, which Brøgger regarded as a historical and not a divine document, which contains some truth, but also a good deal of nonsense, especially when it came to claims about nature and the creation of plants, animals, and human beings. Naturally, Brøgger did not share this liberal view of scripture with conservatives, evangelicals, and Orthodox Grundtvigians within the broad evangelical Lutheran Church. But his very liberal views, were welcomed by many liberal Grundtvigians who wished to remain faithful to both Grundtvig and Darwin. In this way, a specific Danish compromise between Darwinism and Christianity, emphasizing the separation and independence of science and religion, became popular. This contrasts with the British and American cases, where versions of teleological evolution, that is, God-directed evolution, were the normal way for liberal Protestants to come to terms with Darwinism. Now I'll try to sum up the early debate and use a very interesting scientific controversy that was also religious as a way of concluding. And I'll look at two of the most important Danish scientists, Wilhelm Johannsen, a geneticist, and Øyvind Warming, who is a plant ecologist. Because at this time in Denmark and all over the world in the beginning of the 20th century, there was much debate in scientific circles how to understand evolution. How was it? What was the mechanisms behind evolution? Was it the selection theory proposed by Darwin, or was it Lamarckian ideas, or was it genetics and mutation theory? So we have an interesting debate in Denmark where two scientists actually debate the scientific issues here, but also engage in religious matters. So in Denmark, the most vigorous debate over the mechanism that directed the evolutionary process was between the aforementioned father of plant ecology, Øyvind Warming, and the geneticist Wilhelm Johannsen, who was famous for coining the word gene and distinguishing between phenotype and genotype. It is remarkable that the scientific disagreements as defenders of genetics and Lamarckism, respectively, also influenced the debate over science and religion in Denmark. Thus, Wilhelm Johannsen's critique of the scientific status of Darwinism was used by liberal convenience to play down the wider religious and philosophical consequences of the theory that were highlighted by atheists such as Georg Brandes and Wilhelm Rasmussen, while Jürgen Warming's authority was applied by conservative evangelicals to embrace a Lamarckian teleological view of evolution that excluded man from the evolutionary process. So thus, Johannsen, he was contributor to the special issue of the high school magazine that marked the acceptance of evolution among Christian convergents in 1914, while Warming wrote an apologetic pamphlet that was published by an evangelical, that means conservative, organization in 1910. The pamphlet was published in no less than 50,000 copies and later reprinted in magazines and newspapers, and thus reached a wide audience. In the pamphlet, Warming discussed the ambiguous status of the Darwinian theory of natural selection, which he claimed was on its deathbed, and defended the view that evolution was directed by a divine plan. However, Warming made clear that the general theory of evolution was a valid scientific hypothesis, but he suggested that evolution might have happened through parallel lines, and that man was not related to apes. In fact, Warming's position from 1910, when he accepted evolution but defended parallel lines of descent and excluding man from the evolutionary process, was echoed by modern-day Danish creationists 100 years later. And I'll go to that now. So just by summing up, we have three positions in Denmark around 100 years ago. We have conservatives rejecting Darwinian evolution. We have the radical and socialists embracing it and using it as a weapon against Christianity. And then we have this third group accepting both religion, that is Protestantism in Denmark, and science, including Darwinism, so liberal Christians here. And one of my points will be, when I turn to the 21st century, that this third perspective, saying you can be both a Christian and an evolutionist, has been a dominating view in Denmark, in contrast to many other countries. So now we'll go to Europe today, and to some of the work that Jesus and I have done on creationism. I'll talk about modern creationism in Denmark in this second section of the lecture, and it will be based on my chapter on creationism in Scandinavia that I wrote with Peter Kierkegaard for the volume Creationism in Europe. But I'll also include late developments, things that have happened since then. Plus, in the remaining part of the lecture, the focus will be on recent debates over evolution and religion. First of all, to clarify matters, it is worth defining the term creationism. What do we mean by creationism? Creation means to create, and you think of God as the creator. So that is the idea of creationism. Creationism is also the idea that the biblical history in the very beginning of the Bible is literally true. That is how it happened. By using the term creationism in the book Creationism in Europe, we refer to religious belief systems that oppose established evolutionary science. As such, creationism includes also intelligent design, as well as young and old earth creationism, scientific and biblical and indigenous, that is local, and also imported creationism from America. So creationism means a lot of things. And generally speaking, you could say that is religious opposition to modern biological science that is based on evolutionary theory, as we know. Even though religious critiques of Darwinism were widespread in all countries from the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859 and onwards, it was only during the Protestant fundamentalist awakening in the United States in the 1920s that an organized opposition towards evolution was established. Creationism in America soon became an organized movement that successfully combated the teaching of evolutionary science in schools. They actually succeeded in making it illegal to teach evolution in schools in America in many states, mostly the southern and states in the Midwest. For decades, organized creationism remained an American phenomenon. However, from the 1970s, American creationism was imported to Western European countries, including Spain and Denmark. It happened through translation, films, and lectures. And from the early 1980s, creationist organizations and journals were established in several Western European countries. The first European Creationist Congress was held in Belgium in 1984, and in the 1990s, American creationism found a fertile ground in the former communist countries in Eastern Europe. Since then, creationism has flourished in Europe. However, some European organizations and individuals opposing evolutionary theory, they will not accept to be categorized, be called creationists, since it is a stigmatizing label in highly secularized countries such as Denmark and Spain. However, their ideas, arguments, and agendas owe much to American creationism, and with our inclusive definition of creationism, I find it appropriate to use the term creationist about them. After this clarification of the meaning of creationism, I'll turn to creationism in Denmark. First, I will outline the contemporary religious landscape of Denmark. Then I will analyze Danish anti-Darwinian campaigners, including Lutherans, Seventh-day Adventists, Pentecostals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Hare Krishna, Hindus, and Sunni Muslims. So a lot of Christian and non-Christian religions can be very angry at Darwin. Finally, I will conclude by summing up why creationism remains a relatively marginalized phenomenon in Denmark compared to most of the rest of the world. Here is a survey. It's easy to see here. Several polls have revealed that Denmark is among the countries in which most people accept the theory of evolution. Side by side with other North-European countries and Japan, Denmark is placed at the top when it comes to the acceptance of human evolution. These countries are followed by Southern and Eastern European countries such as Spain, where polls revealed that 73% accepted human evolution in 2005, and 53% identified as evolutionists, and only 11% as creationists in 2011. That is in Spain. Moreover, a recent survey by Eurobarometer from 2021 documented that 67% of the population in the EU accept human evolution, while the percentage in Spain was increased to 75%. So 3 out of 4 Spanish people would answer and would accept that evolution had happened. But 25 would say, I don't know, or reject the idea of human evolution. And in Denmark, the number stabilized at 83% accepting human evolution. This level of acceptance of evolution, it's much lower in Turkey, Russia, America, Africa, and the Middle East, and the rest of the world. Most of the rest of the world, the majority of the people would reject the idea of human evolution. For instance, in Africa and the Middle East, and also in Russia nowadays. In America, they're split like more or less 50-50 between evolutionists and creationists. In Denmark, between 80 and 90% of the population accept human evolution, and only very few clergymen, that is priests, and politicians have suggested to include creationism and intelligent design as scientific alternatives to evolutionary theory in biology classes. This is no surprise since sociologists and historians of religion generally consider Denmark and the other Scandinavian countries some of the most secularized countries in the world. In 2008, the American sociologist Bill Zuckerman went as far as entitling his book about the religious views of the Danish society without God. No doubt, Zuckerman is right when he argues that religion is much less visible in Denmark than in America. However, another American sociologist, Andrew Boxer, who has studied secularization and religious life in Denmark, uses the Danish case to warn us against focusing too narrowly on supernatural belief and theological doctrines when studying religious practices. Thus, with his focus on people's views on certain theological doctrines such as the virgin birth and the existence of hell, Zuckerman seems to understate the influence of religion in Denmark, which is much more evident in what people are doing than in what they are saying. Thus, in 2010, no less than 80.9% of the Danish population were members of the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church. And even though the number has decreased rapidly, partly due to immigration, the percentage is now 72.1% that are members of the national church. And the majority of Danes, they see themselves as Christians. They have their children baptized and attend service at least at Christmas. For most Danes, Christianity is a natural part of their culture and tradition, but in general, they are not much concerned with religious doctrines, the reading of scripture, or the existence of God in their daily life. In fact, whilst 72.1% of the Danish population are members of the national church, in 2017, only 51% believe in God. So we have quite a large group of the Danes being members of the church that don't believe in God. That's easy. That's difficult for foreigners to understand, but that's just the way it is. They stay in the church. They like the church. It's good for like different kind of services when people die, when people are born, when they get married, and so forth. So it's a very cultural function of the church, so to speak. And if we compare to other countries, in comparison, the percentage believing in God in Spain in 2017 was 68%. And in Poland, it was no less than 93%. Zuckerman has made an important, we have the percentages here of the Danish different religious groups, and you can see that the far biggest one is the Danish National Church, and we have small Christian groups with quite few people, members. We have 300,000 Muslims nowadays. This is the do you believe in God thing here. Zuckerman has made an important point when arguing that American-style activist, aggressive and fundamentalist Protestantism is marginalized in Denmark. Evangelicals belong to the far right of the Evangelical Lutheran Church and often escape outside the Evangelical Lutheran Church to small private churches outside the dominating and state-sponsored established church. And this church has very liberal views, the national church, concerning issues such as female pastors, for instance, abortion, homosexuality, and indeed evolution. Outside the Protestant mainstream, we find small communities of Jehovah's Witnesses, Pentecostals, and Seventh-day Adventists in which fundamentalist and creationist views are being advocated. In 2006, also Islamic advocates of creationism, inspired and hired by the Turkish godfather of creationism, with the name Adnan Oktar and known as Harun Yahya, entered the stage. While the Christian creationists have their difficulties making their views heard, there are reasons to believe that Harun Yahya's well-organized internet campaigns against Darwinism have found fertile ground among the 300,000 Muslims living in Denmark, since we have not yet seen any religious authorities among Muslims openly embracing evolution. Like in Spain, organized creationism in Denmark is restricted to Protestant evangelical circles at the conservative end of the theological spectrum. That is also to say that creationism has never, like an organized opposition towards Darwin, has never really been a big thing among Catholics. It's mainly a Protestant thing, and nowadays also a Muslim, Islamic thing, and other groups. But the Catholics have very seldom organized against evolution. The most important anti-evolutionary group in Denmark is connected to the Danish-Norwegian journal called Origo, which was launched in 1983 as what was called a scientific journal and an apologetic resource for Protestants with evangelical leanings, including Lutheran, Pentecostals, and Adventists. In 2010, the journal had around 950 subscribers, so it's a small journal and a small organization. Since 2001, the journal and the group Origo has hosted the webpage Skabelse DK, meaning Creation DK, which offers lectures in science and evolution, a creationist textbook aimed at evangelical schools that should function as a supplement to the state-sanctioned biology textbooks, and translation of books by intelligent design advocates such as Jonathan Wells and Michael Behe. Moreover, in the Darwin year of 2009, Urigo published a children's book, a Darwin biography, and a critique of Darwinism. However, these publications were far from being bestsellers. The circulation numbers were well under 1,000 copies, while in comparison, pro-evolutionary books on science and religion published in 2009 by the National Evangelical Lutheran Church and aimed at primary and secondary schools were distributed in more than 10,000 copies. So the mainline Protestant Denmark would embrace evolution. Unlike the American and Turkish creationists, the journal Urigo does not have a strong financial backing. The editors, contributors, and lecturers are unpaid volunteers, and the webpage does not include flashy audiovisual effects like the American and Turkish creationist pages. However, while they are low in economic capital, the Danish creationists score relatively high when it comes to cultural capital. That means the level of education. The editorial board includes scientists with master or PhD degrees in biology, biochemistry, bioethics, physics, and engineering, and even philosophy of science. Most contributors to the journal are old Earth creationists and intelligent design supporters and have more liberal views on scripture than mainstream American creationists generally do. In the arguments against Darwinian evolution, the Danish anti-Darwinists are careful to distance themselves from the heated rhetoric of American and Turkish creationists, who prefer to accuse Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution of being the cause of modern evils such as terrorism, fascism, communism. So he's seen as the big enemy and the big evil of modern times, Charles Darwin, among American and Turkish creationists, but not among the Danish. They are more calm, so to speak. At a public conference in 2009, the professor of philosophy of science and founding editor of the creationist journal Urigo, Peter Ørstrøm, even felt that it was necessary to warn against the demonizing of Darwin put forth by American and Turkish creationists. Ørstrøm and his colleagues claimed that their critique is strictly scientific and philosophical, and aid that the mythology of scientific naturalism, which they regard as the atheist and materialist ideological foundation of modern evolutionary science. In order to advocate their anti-materialist agenda, the Urigo editors introduced the theory of intelligent design on Danish soil in the year 2000, when they devoted an issue of the journal to the theory, which they consider a valid scientific alternative to Darwinian theory. Mainstream biologists wouldn't accept evolution as a valid theory, but they do, these Danish intelligent design advocates. In 2007, Ørstrøm succeeded in getting a book on intelligent design published by a Danish university press. So that's quite a success. From the Darwin year in 2009 and the next decade, the activities of the Danish and Norwegian creationist society diminished. They had difficulties getting media attention outside their own small evangelical circles. The lack of financial support to the creationist society resulted in the decision to only publish their journal twice a year and only online. So they really needed money. But in 2019, things changed. The Norwegian branch of Urigo, Danish and Norwegian are two languages very close to each other, so Norwegians and Danish people would understand each other, so you can easily make a journal together and understand what is written in there. But in 2019, the Norwegian branch of Urigo succeeded in getting a sponsor. It was the very, very wealthy ship owner and actually billionaire Einar Johan Rasmussen, and he established the foundation Biokosmos. Biokosmos, actually we see foundation in more than one country called Biokosmos. That's normally very rich, often newborn Christians, very devoted evangelicals, some would call them fundamentalists, trying to spend their money on fighting Darwin, so to speak, because they see a contrast between evolution and religion. And one of them was this Norwegian ship owner, Einar Johan Rasmussen. He This economic support to the Scandinavian creationists gave them the possibility of increasing their online activities by the establishment of a new flashy web page, you see here, advocating creationism and intelligent design. The donation of no less than 2 million euros to the Scandinavian creationists meant a great boost to the battle against Darwinism and Darwinian evolution in schools and elsewhere. So maybe creationism in the coming years will gain some more ground in the Scandinavian countries. At least now they have the money to go for it and try to fight biology in schools and evolutionary theory in schools. Among the Origo contributors, the Danish and Norwegian creationists, their views on evolution are different. While Østrøm and another prominent affiliate, Christian Østergaard, draw on arguments from intelligent design theorists such as Michael Behe, Wilhelm Dembski, and Jonathan Wells, other contributors prefer mainstream American young earth creationism. Unlike other countries such as Netherlands, America, and Turkey, these differences among the creationists, they have big debates about how to understand the Bible and modern science, how to figure it out. Is the world only 6,000 years old, or could it be millions of years old according to Genesis? There's a wide debate among the creationists. But even though they don't agree on the details, they haven't split in Denmark. They are united in one society because they all share the Christian worldview and criticize the paradigmatic status of modern evolutionary biology. So they are against mainstream biology. However, the most popular position among the Danish creationists seems to be two Germans, theory by two Germans, Reinhard Juncker and Siegfried Scherer. And they have this theory of basic types, and it's a brilliant theory. Very interesting theory. Not that I'm in favor of it, but it's well thought, I would say. This theory argues that microevolution has taken place through parallel lines of descent from original basic types, such as dogs, horses, and most importantly, humans. You can see the model here. We have man there and dog, and so forth. The good thing about this theory is that, according to this theory, humans, they are not related to the apes. That's the controversial thing. We have nothing to do with the apes, so that's a relief to them, so to speak. Moreover, and also important among creationists, is that this theory of basic types can be integrated in a literal reading of scripture, since the basic types of life can be interpreted as the original animals and humans that survived the Genesis flood on Noah's Ark. So that is the animals being at Noah's Ark, and we have the few people there too. Thus, in this way, creationists can accept microevolution and at the same time believe in the literal truth of the Bible. So most creationists, they will actually accept a limited kind of evolution, but not the macro evolution. What's interesting is that history repeats itself often within history of science and religion, because in fact, this position, the Reinhard Scherer and Siegfried Scherer and the Reinhard Juncker position that the Danish creationists support too, this position in many ways resembles the position of the most prominent Danish critics of Darwinism, of Darwinian evolution 100 years earlier. The aforementioned evangelical professor of plant ecology, Eugen Warming, and the Jesuit secondary school teacher, Armand Breitun, the Catholic, who were eager to exclude humans from the evolutionary process and argue for parallel lines of descent. So in this way, history repeats itself. If we look at where creationism takes place in Denmark, we have to look to Jutland, rural areas of Denmark. The hotbed of creationism in Denmark is the evangelical high school in the town of Ringkøbing in rural western Jutland. Since the foundation of Origo in 1983, this small private school have hosted several creationist congresses. In 1985, for example, the very renowned English young earth creationist Arthur E. Wilder-Smith delivered no less than 8 lectures in 4 days before an audience of up to 100 people. Among the teachers in Ringkøbing, we find the former leader of the small Christian People's Party, a small party in Denmark, Marianne Korsmose, who in 2002 advocated the teaching of creationism in Danish schools, and the webmaster of Origo's webpage and author of the above-mentioned creationist textbook, the biologist Christian Østergaard, who practices the so-called teach both sides argument in his advanced biology classes. So the students would read about like the official history of evolution and evolutionary biology, but then he'll give them his alternative book and say, but you could also understand this way with intelligent design and basic types of life and so forth. And that's not illegal in Denmark because we have quite liberal laws when it comes to education. So you're most welcome to supplement the teaching that you have to do with other things. So they can legitimately include the creationism in the biology classes. Another Origo affiliate, the Seventh-day Adventist and young Earth creationist Holger Daugaard, taught biology at the Danish Adventist High School in the town of Vejle in Eastern Jutland until his retirement in 2019. And I have a thing that I've been looking forward to show you here. This is a diploma from a kind of course or module, because Daugaard has launched a correspondence course on creation and evolution, which I've had the pleasure of enrolling and even passing as part of my research. And it was really old-fashioned a few years ago, but he would send a letter and then I'll answer the questions, most of them arguing for kind of creationist views. I'll send back the answers to him and he will come with a response. I'll get a new one. Maybe you've tried this kind of courses. And I passed. I don't know. I don't think it was that difficult to pass the test. So I have this diploma in a course in creationism. Besides passing this course, I have had email correspondence with several creationists, and they have been more than willing to inform me about their scientific religious views, their networks, and the print run of their publication. Some of them I would even call one of my friends. I worked with him and studied with him at the History of Science department. Another one, Peter Ostrom, he got furious when we published this book because he's a Pentecostal and he thought that we didn't treat the Pentecostals in the right way, so he felt that he was misinterpreted, and he won't call himself a creationist. So we had some discussions there. So it was not favorably reviewed in the Creationist Journal of book. So maybe that's a good sign. I don't know. Among the Pentecostals who are eager to promote creationism, they often refer to like the big creationist movement in America among Christian creationists is an organization called Answers in Genesis, and it is formed by Ken Ham, and he's a very strong young Earth creationist, and that's dominating creationist position in the U.S. So the Americans, being creationists, they believe that the world is only 6,000, maybe 10,000 years old. So that's quite a conservative position within creationists. We also find the creationists among some reborn Christian lay preachers without a theological degree from the university in Denmark. I have an example here. For example, it generates some local attention when in 2009, the pastor of a small independent evangelical church in the village of Løkken in northern Denmark, northern Jutland, the place where my family comes from actually, put up a handwritten poster at the front of the church stating, you see it here, Darwin's theories have not been scientifically proved. Darwin theories are religion to those who reject God. So this is really local and very small scale creationism. As my family in Løkken told me, most local people found this creationist campaign ridiculous, and the pastor himself found himself quite busy writing new posters every time local boys removed the old ones. They had to put up new ones every few days. This incident no doubt tells us something about the difference in religious attitudes among Danish and American mainline Protestants. Creationism, biblical fundamentalism, and activist Protestantism simply seem strange and ridiculous to most members of the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church. The sectarian Jehovah's Witnesses, which is among the largest Christian denominations outside the Evangelical Lutheran Church, have also promoted their version of old Earth creationism in pamphlets and books, generally offered free of charge to people interested. However, their publications are translated from English and they have not generated any public notice. Another interesting example of creationism in Denmark is creationism and anti-Darwinism promoted by the Hare Krishna monk like Espai Ciència, who has founded the Danish Society for Intelligent Design and promoted the unorthodox ideas of his fellow Vedic Michael Primo, who argues against all established science, I would say, that modern man can trace back his history trillions of years, and that all professional archaeologists hide the evidence in favor of this fact. In 2004, Espai wrote a short introduction to intelligent design, and in 2006, he published his translation of Michael Primo and Richard Thompson's bestseller, Forbidden Archaeology. It attracted some media attention and critique from university staff when in 2009, Espai and Primo lectured twice before small audiences at unofficial meetings at Aarhus University. It's very important for creationists and intelligent design advocates to get into the universities, because then it looks like it's established science. So they will often try to get rooms at universities, then they can advertise afterwards that they lectured at universities to make it kind of legitimate science, and they succeeded here. Furthermore, when my research group at Aarhus University, Interdisciplinary Evolutionary Studies, launched the web-based outreach project Evolution DK on 1st of February 2009, it did not take long before Espai had created the webpage No Evolution DK. However, Esmai's anti-Darwinist society does not seem to be much more than an idiosyncratic one-man project. Okay, unlike the Christian and Hindu anti-Darwinian campaigns in Denmark, the promotion of old Earth creationism by the Sunni Muslim Adnan Oktar is well-funded and has been much debated in the newspapers. In line with many other European countries, from December 2006 to September 2007, the first part of the English version of Paunya's massive Atlas of Creation was sent to politicians, scientists, high school teachers, and evangelical Lutheran pastors. My former colleague and director of interdisciplinary evolutionary studies at the Aarhus University, Peter Kjærgaard, received his copy in 2006 when he launched the research and outreach project Darwin in Denmark. And I have received my 2 copies of the work from a professor of botany and a pastor in southern Denmark who has never made any public statements about Darwin or evolution. My estimate is that between 500 and 1,000 Danes have received a copy of Atlas of Creation with the post, and it has been a costly affair since each copy weighs more than 5 kilos. It's a massive volume arguing for creationism against Darwinism. Moreover, one of Paunya's more than 150 books has been translated into Danish, and his flashy web pages are being promoted by a Muslim society in Denmark's second biggest city, Aarhus. Another strategy that's interesting, used by Paunya's disciples to promote creationism, is manipulating web calls on evolution to make it look as though creationist views are gaining ground after the publication of his Atlas of Creation. This has been done in Germany, France, and in Denmark. In 2007 and 2009, polls on the webpage of the Danish tabloid Ekstrabladet were manipulated by Turkish votes. The results were that the polls showed that 88 and 59% of the Danes, you see the change here, denied human evolution. In 2007, a change happened overnight from 78% accepting that man descended from the apes, as it was phrased, to 90% rejecting it. When analyzing the votes in 2009, a journalist of the newspaper found out that more than half of the votes came from Turkey, actually, even though it's a Danish language newspaper. The journalist invited the readers to send their questions about evolution to Adnan Oktar and his employee, Seda Aral. Their detailed answers were published on the webpage a month later. Here Oktar claimed, among many other things, that the forerunner of human beings billions ago was also human beings, and that living things have never changed. There exists not a single transitional form of fossil. to confirm the claims of Darwinists. So they completely reject all kind of evolution, including intelligent design. Hjermitslev fame and impact climaxed around 2007 when the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe found it necessary to warn against the dangers of creationism in education. Since then, Okta has been jailed in Turkey, and the criminal methods of his organization has been revealed. Been a lot of problems. The third and fourth volumes of Hjermitslev Atlas of Creation were published in 2007 and 12, but since then the Muslim creationists have not received much attention in Denmark. However, it's unclear how much impact his web pages have on the Muslim population in Denmark. Its studies of Muslim attitudes towards evolution in other European countries. It is shown how well-educated Muslims are critical towards Hjermislev's shallow propaganda. They know better, they are more informed about science, so they have more well-thought ways of integrated science and religion than Hjermislev's complete refusal of evolution. This is the newest poll on creationism in the European countries, EU countries. Now I will turn to discussing how we can explain the strong support of evolution and the marginal role of creationism among mainstream Danish Protestants, which is confirmed in this 2021 Eurobarometer survey. As the sociologist Espai Ciència points out, the traditional explanation of why creationism is less popular in Denmark than in America are that European societies are more secular, that the dominating churches, including the Lutheran churches in Northern Europe, have accepted the theory of evolution, and finally that the majority of European churches do not advocate evangelical Christianity. Furthermore, Ciència adds that unlike the lively religious marketplace in America, with dominations, that is sect groups of religious Christian beliefs, these denominations, they can compete between each other and advertise their views in the media in order to get customers, so to speak, in the churches. That is not the case with the Danish national church in Denmark and the other broad national churches in Northern Europe. They play a very different role than in America. They are primarily cultural institutions, as I mentioned earlier, with strong symbolic meanings and as markers of key moments in people's life. The broad scope of the national churches means that the religious focus is much more directed against consensus and homogeneity than against highlighting differences on controversial issues such as evolutionary theory. No doubt these structural factors can help explaining the difference between Protestants in America and in Europe on issues such as evolution. However, I would like to add some further reasons for the marginal role of creationism specific to Denmark. They relate to the theological tradition of the country that I discussed in the beginning of the lecture. Firstly, evangelicals in Denmark have focused much more on the New Testament than on the history of creation as recorded in Genesis 1, the very beginning of the Bible and the Old Testament, which is the fundamental document of Christian creationists. It all depends on the first page of the history of creation, but it's not that important in Denmark. The focus is on the New Testament. Secondly, mainstream Lutheranism in Denmark is strongly influenced by the teaching of the aforementioned 19th century theologian Grundtvig, who downplayed the importance of what he referred to as the dead letters of the Bible and emphasized that the cornerstone of Christianity were the two sacraments, Protestantism, that is baptism and communion, and the Apostolic Creed, which he claimed was the living word of Christ delivered to his disciples. Grundtvig's critique of traditional Lutheran scriptural theology made it rather easy for many adherents in 20th century Denmark to accept theories such as Darwinian evolution, which seems to challenge a literal reading of scripture. As a contrast, it is worth noticing that in America, conservative Wisconsin and Missouri Lutherans remained theocentrics well into the 20th century, where numbers he has shown how very conservative Lutherans in America, they kept to the old worldview with the earth in the center and the sun around the earth, until less than 100 years ago. That's quite something. But that didn't happen in Denmark among Lutherans. Third, in order to be ordained to the Evangelical Lutheran Church, pastors in Denmark, they must have received their theological degree from one of the faculties of theology at the national universities in Aarhus and Copenhagen. In the 20th century, academic theology had been strongly influenced, on the one hand, German biblical criticism. The Bible is a historical book, you shouldn't read it in a fundamentalist way, and so forth. And on the other hand, influenced by liberal, existential, and dialectical theology. These modernist theological positions have rejected the infallibility of Scripture, as well as the tradition of natural theology and the ambition of finding explanations of natural phenomena in the Bible. Moreover, following the 19th century Danish theologian and philosopher Søren Kierkegaard and his protagonist, the 19th century professor of philosophy Rasmus Nielsen, who combined the teaching of Grundtvig and Kierkegaard, most Danish theologians and lay people have found it more or less unproblematic to make a radical distinction between knowledge and faith. And this separation model of science and religion has provided Danish Protestants with the intellectual resources needed in order to embrace the theory of evolution. To conclude, the dissemination of creationism in Denmark is marginal compared to other countries with a Protestant majority. Moreover, Danish creationists generally avoid the kind of aggressive campaigns against Darwin and evolution we have witnessed in America and elsewhere. The influence of creationism on the Danish school system is limited to a few private Christian and Muslim schools. It is worth noticing that most creationist campaigners are based in rural areas in Jutland, and that they are exclusively male. That's quite interesting. I haven't found any female creationists. It could be interesting with a gender perspective on creationism. I have argued that the main reasons for the marginal role of creationism in Denmark are the general secularization of the country in the 20th century, the moderating role of the broad and liberal national church, and not least the specific theological tradition which have dominated Denmark in the last 2 centuries. To sum up and finish the lecture, we have come to the third and final section of my lecture. I will outline avenues of further international research into the relationship between evolution and religion. First, we need more transnational historical studies of the circulation of evolutionary and creationist ideas through translation, journals, networks, and conferences. For practical reasons, most studies of Darwinism and creationism have focused on the national or regional level. However, at the date of the publication of Charles Darwin on the Origin of Species in 1859, the process of globalization had already begun. Scientific ideas rapidly traveled across borders. We need to know much more about how this happened and about how ideas were modified and appropriated, used and changed in this process of crossing borders. Secondly, we need anthropological studies of creationist groups by means of qualitative methods such as fieldwork, participatory observations, and interviews. This will help us answer crucial questions such as why and how people hold and advocate creationist views and support creationist organizations. Third, we need quantitative surveys of teachers and pupils at religious schools in order to estimate the impact of creationist campaigns and understand how teachers and pupils integrate their views on evolution, creation, science, and religion. We haven't had a single study of schools and the way they teach evolution in religious schools, at least not in Denmark. So that would be very useful also in other countries. We need these kind of studies. Fourth and finally, we need better and more sophisticated international quantitative surveys on people's views on evolution and religion. It is important that new surveys avoid clash narratives of evolution and religion in the framing of evolutionary science as atheistic, and that they are sensitive to important distinction between evolution in general and human evolution. There is actually a big difference whether you accept evolution in general but exclude human evolution, or whether you actually accept human evolution. And also you have to make distinction between theistic evolution that is perfectly acceptable within a scientific view. It can be adopted with modern biology, and on the other hand, intelligent design that is not recognized as a scientific theory. Thus, scholars of science and religion, historians as well as sociologists, have much further work to do. Hopefully, EU, state and private funding will make it possible to establish international collaborations that can investigate the interesting relationship between evolution and religion in Europe in the future. Thank you very much for your attention. You have been very patient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Henry, for this masterful panorama about the history of evolution and religion and Denmark, going beyond the traditional narratives of the substantial conflict. So ultimately, today, by some journalists, for example, writers, I think that historians of science have failed in diffusing these alternative and more fine-grained perspectives. But well, this is a question beyond the aims of this conference. A question.
I would like to debate. Isn't your lecture really about science versus pseudoscience?
Yeah.
And when you put up on one of your latest slides, you put evolutionary ideas versus creationist ideas, but evolutionary science.
Yeah.
I mean, today I think it's very important to give science the respect it deserves. And it's really very concerning that the extent of creationist beliefs in modern day Europe. In the Eurobarometer chart, I saw that in Slovakia, 48% of people don't believe that we are descended from animals. So I think perhaps that was an unfortunate phrasing of the question. It would have been better to say earlier species of humanoid or something. But still, 8% in Slovakia. Amazing. And that's after 45 years of atheist communism. And in Russia, of course, even more. Because in a previous chart, you showed the number of people who believe in an evolutionary theory of mankind versus creationists, and in Poland and in Russia, it's very low indeed. You wonder, does education have no impact?
No, it doesn't. This is very interesting perspectives, and thank you very much. What is interesting? It is a very interesting case, especially when I saw this relatively new numbers. I just from preparation for today, I found this new survey. You have to say that this survey might be it's a part of the Eurobarometer, and actually this question, the idea of this question is that they have to find out how much people know about science. So people would think that we have to say yes if they have had biology in school, because then they would know that we have this idea of human evolution. But even though that they might know from the education that it might be right, they'll still write no, they wouldn't accept it for, I suppose, religious reason. And the Eastern European countries, they are very, very interesting. Some researchers have focused on the fact that when around 1990, the Warsaw group fell down and the Cold War stopped. Now it has started again, of course, in a way. People were religious ignorance, so to speak. They were allowed to be freely religious now, but what they imported was American creationism. So they imported McDonald's, Nike shoes, and everything, but also American creationism. So the American creationists, different religious groups, were very early on in the 1990s to make their views heard in the Eastern European countries. And many people, they thought maybe, okay, that is the way you're a Christian. If you're a Christian, you cannot accept evolution. Many of the creationist books were translated to the Eastern European languages. And the Russian case, that is quite exceptional, because we have seen during the last 20 years, during Putin's campaign, that he has allied with the Russian Orthodox Church. They support Putin. And as part of the Russian Orthodox Church and their cultural struggle against Western values, they include Darwin as like some of the bad things from the West. So Darwinism, evolutionary theory, has become a bad thing from the West. So the Russian Orthodox Church, they have a very anti-Darwinian, anti-scientific, we would say, outlook here. But of course, at the universities in Russia, they still use modern biology, otherwise they wouldn't be able to research. So, and the same with the Muslim countries, even though the majority of people don't accept human evolution, the scientists in Iran and Saudi Arabia and so forth, of course, they use the best knowledge we have about evolution. So, but among the people, it is a minority that accept evolution. So it is quite interesting, this thing. Of course, you could say that it's science versus the pseudoscience, and in many ways, both people would say that you're right. But I try to, like, as a historian, try to back down, and I'll say, if they claim it is science, then I have to not accept it as science, but I have to accept the claim that they call it an alternative. So I have to, in a way, to be objective as a historian, just document what they argue, in fact. So I would say, as a historian, that established biologists, established scientists, all accept evolutionary theory. They might not agree on details. There are different kind of course, debates among scientists, but in general, of course, evolutionary biology is accepted among scientists. So, so when people ask me, I'll say I'm not a biological expert, but all experts say that, of course, evolution has taken place, and intelligent design, that is not science, that's pseudoscience. So that would be the general view among established biologists, as you would know.
You know, a parallel to belief in creationism would surely the idea of climate change, climate or the climate catastrophe that we're facing.
Yeah.
There's a connection there, surely, and I imagine
there is
some evangelicals and right-wing populism.
Yeah,
there's a kind of an allied front there.
Yeah, another good point. You're perfectly right. In America, it is typical for Republicans to be against evolution and against the idea of climate change caused by humans. And that is, if you want to be a presidential candidate for the Republicans, then you have to deny evolution and climate change. That is the way it is. Trump, he also have made critical remarks against evolutionary theory and the idea of climate change caused by humans. So it's a big cultural study struggling in the States. And we can also see, are you pro-life or do you think that women in certain circumstances should be allowed to have an abortion? You can see the same distinction. So it is really clear-cut in America, this. And the point would be for me that in Denmark, it is much more in the middle, much more messy. People are a little bit religious and they believe in evolution. So it's like, as Jesus said, we have to, as historians, we have to be, I think it's a big role for us to say that the story is not evolution or religion, but there are many places in between. And that's where many people actually are in many countries, including Denmark. And I suppose the same would be the case in Spain. The majority of people in Spain, they are members of Catholic Church, I think, and we can see that around 70% accept human evolution. So it seems like in Spain, people are actually able to be both evolutionists and Christians. And that's an important story to tell, I think.
Well, I have a lot of questions, I believe, but time's over, unfortunately. So thank you very much. Once more. Well, you're invited for the next colloquium, but the next academic year, organized by the Società Catalana d'Història. Thank you very much.
Thank you.